What are some of the big trends that you've been, talking to some of the attendees that have been approaching your stand and, in the cybersecurity space as a whole?
Okay, it's a great question. There's a number of things we could talk about. I want to start with our software vulnerability report, which we've just released. So that's based on about 4,000 application tests on about 2,000 apps over the last 3 years, and there's some interesting trends in that. So one of them is that overall vulnerabilities are actually slightly down. And we believe that's to do with a better stance. So what's happening is developers are improving the baseline of sorts of vulnerabilities. However, there are some concerns still. Things like information leakage is still a major issue there. And configuration, software configuration has moved up a lot in the last 3 years, from number 9 position in our report to number 5. So we're seeing cloud-based applications being misconfigured, leaving ports open, leaving services running, default passwords and so on. So there's some initial interesting findings. That then leads on to the second point, a huge increase in open source vulnerabilities. Now, the actual activity that we are looking at there is pen test, black box type testing. So they're not going to see all of the open source issues, only the ones that can be discovered by that technique. But a companion report, which is the OSRA report, open source software annual report produced by Synopsys, that shows that vulnerabilities in software are way up. Okay, so we're talking about a 500% increase in vulnerabilities in the last 3 years, and software supply chain hacks as well. And I think as a separate point, the Forrester report of last year showed that as well. 26% of breaches in the last year were due to supply chain, and another 25% were due to open source vulnerabilities. So this is where a lot of problems are occurring. And again, looking at that report, the OSRA report, we're seeing somewhere around 85% of applications that we looked at, and again it's thousands of applications, were vulnerable, and 75% of them were vulnerable to high or critical issues with remote code executions, and this is what we're actually seeing, is applications are now the front line of leaking data.
Another big trend we've seen in the application security space is AI. Could you give us a little bit of insight into how AI is impacting the way organizations defend their applications?
Sure, it's a good question. AI is driving a lot of productivity in the developer cycle. I saw something that is between about 40 and 70% increase in productivity, which is huge. However, there are very many risks associated with this. So that code that's being generated in IDEs by large language models has been trained on public data, and that public data isn't secure. Okay, because by definition, it's a lot of it's open source and hasn't necessarily been scanned, so there are going to be vulnerabilities in there. Furthermore, last week I heard about a problem on GitHub where there are hundreds of thousands of repos being created with copying open source and inserting malware, and they're doing a great job of tracking that down, but there will be some that get through, and that may end up in the large language model because it's being trained, and so you're going to get code generated which may have malware in it, may in its own right not be secure. A lot of the time the code that's being written, it can sometimes be inaccurate because it's hallucinating. I think that's a problem there. So real big issues about what we do about this. So the point to make is that code that's being copied from the public space, some of it is restrictively licensed. And if you include even one line of that code from a restrictive licensed piece of open source, that, under the terms of the license, means that your whole application becomes open source. And that's a very serious issue. Now, we've been dealing with that issue in standard coding for decades now, but that concern is something that's really needs to be looked into, because identifying where that code came from and whether or not that has a restrictive license is a major issue. So these are the sorts of trends that we're seeing.
I think it was a recent In360 podcast where they were actually talking about that issue. And these LLMs, they are themselves insecure at the moment. The quality of the data is not enough to create that code, so they can't create secure applications. And that's the problem that we're facing, and it's a really good point that you made there. One last question for you today. If you could use one word to describe the current state of cybersecurity in 2024, what would it be and why?
Evolving is the word that I would use, because we have a long history of securing applications with traditional techniques that are well known and mature. Probably not as well adopted as they should be, because there's a lot of development going on without anything. But then those techniques have to be moved onto the rapidly changing landscape. Cloud platforms, the way that applications are hosted and developed, and the type of AI threats. And don't forget, AI can also be not just generating the code, it can also be part of the solution. And that's where things like the OWASP top 10 for LLM come in. So, the sorts of risks that we need to manage there. So, and even if you look at that top 10, it's not clear how we're going to deal with a lot of those challenges. They're really, they've identified that they exist, but, data poisoning, what do we do about that? There is no model at the moment, so. Yeah.